every so often we get really lucky here on Public Exposure. In fact, it's 12 times a year because it's Sound Month in Review time with Joel Connelly and Mike Seeley right here on Public Exposure. I'm Stan Emmert, and actually we don't have Mike Seeley because he's had a really kind of a nice thing that's happened to him. But Joel, welcome.
Mike has become a father for the second time.
That's a good reason to not be here tonight, so he'll be back next month.
An excused absence.
Yes, for sure. So Joel, SeattlePI.com. We have so much to go over. Happy holidays. Is it a holiday in the Seattle mayor's race?
No, it's not. It's full-time. The Mayor McGinn is having press conferences to announce mainly good news things almost every single workday of the week. Tim Burgess announced a couple of weeks ago has already collected more than $25,000. And Ed Murray, who is forbidden from raising money while the legislature's in session, had a big do on Wednesday night. And we still have Bruce Harrell pondering things. We still have Ron Sims keeping his options open. We still have Peter Steinbrück talking about the race. We could have a very full mayor's race, or simply the 3 or 4 heavies like we now have in the race.
Here's the thing that I, as a Seattle citizen, a Seattle voter, am wondering. I'm not sure that I've been particularly happy with the city administration for a long time. Is there a possibility that there's going to be significant change, or are all of these people just retreads?
First of all, there would be change to the police department should Burgess be elected. He did a very thoughtful paper. The gist of it was that we should reorient the way we deploy the police and deploy them to areas that experience the greatest amount of crime as an almost preemptive measure, and also study very carefully where that crime occurs. He delivered this paper almost a year ago when he left the Public Safety Committee. I was impressed by it, so there would be change in that field. Ed Murray is a very forceful, very decisive person, as I discovered during watching him push through incrementally gay rights and then gay marriage, and then watching him forcefully defend it this last year. A little bit sympathetic since he is, a pro-marriage equality Catholic. And also, McGinn seems to be getting it. McGinn, with good news announcements, learning slowly to make common cause with other people, and nonetheless, and getting good advice.
Well, now the last time that he ran, when he got elected, essentially the field wasn't very strong, and it got down to where it kind of fizzled out among the people who were there. With all of these reasonably strong candidates in, does that make it worse for Mayor McGinn in his reelection, or does that make it better for him?
There are a large number of candidates. It increases the odds that the mayor will be able to skate into the finals. There are certain candidates, Bruce Harrell, the city councilman, for example, that could hurt McGinn, because McGinn has spent an awful lot of energy building a political base in southeast Seattle. Such things as sending the rebuild of the Rainier Community Center back to the drawing boards to make sure that minorities and women were involved in the contracting work, stuff of this nature. And if Harrell comes in, or if Ron Sims were to run, this would take away part of the mayor's base. Well, the famous adage, you can't forecast the future, but a big race tends to favor the person who's already there.
We are 11 months away from the election, though. I mean, isn't it too early for a Seattle mayor's race?
My friend Craig, who's a journalist up in Vancouver, shakes his head at the length of these things. They're going to have a provincial election in the Great White North next year. The campaign will last 29 days. When they have a national election in the Great White North, the campaign lasts less than 2 months. So this long period of endless endorsement meetings, they last up to 5 hours in various district Democratic organizations and this side of thing. Pandering, interest group pandering all summer long is maddening.
Yeah. Well, we'll find out for sure. You wrote a column not too long ago, and the headline was, "Even Seattle Needs a Viable Republican Party." What's the operative word there?
I think it was viable. I think there needs to be competitive, competition of ideas, and there also needs to be a moderate force in the city's politics. And it used to be a moderate and constructive force before the Republicans moved so far to the right and so many Democrats moved into Seattle. You had people like, well, Paul Krabel, John Miller, Bruce Chapman on the city council a generation ago, who were part of the reform of city government, but they're Republicans.
Why can't there be a viable Republican Party in Seattle now?
I think they've damaged the brand too much, that people associate Republicans with Richard Murdoch, the candidate in Indiana who talked about, rape being, the rapist child being a gift from God. You have the candidate for Congress here, John Koster, talked about the rape thing. And you had Mitt Romney with the 47% and liking to fire people and so on. People are just so alienated from the Republican brand that even a very attractive Republican. I was out in Hawaii for a few days after the election. Mm-hmm. Linda Lingle, a former two-term governor of Hawaii, ran for the U.S. Senate, was much touted. U.S. Chamber of Commerce backed her $2.5 million worth and so on. She got about 38% of the vote. Whoa. So damaged is the Republican brand there, and I think here, that it becomes difficult even for the most attractive person.
And, in this past governor's election, there was a very attractive gubernatorial Republican candidate who almost won. But I personally believe that it was largely due to just what you said, the national brand couldn't be overcome.
Yeah, when your presidential candidate is losing the state by 650,000 votes, winning the state becomes a little more difficult.
The State House has done something interesting with regard to its leadership, and I put that term in quotes. I'm not sure that I truly understand it. The claim that it is a bipartisan leadership group, is that right?
Quite often, and you have this in New York as well, you sometimes have a few Democrats peeling off, joining the Republicans and forming a de facto temporary new majority. We had it with the State House of Representatives years ago. And you now have a very conservative Democrat from Shelton and a somewhat conservative and somewhat self-important Democrat from the East Side. Basically...
Okay, let's name names here.
Rodney Tom.
Okay.
Excuse me. And the opportunity to dominate on the writing of budgets. I think a little bit of genuine frustration at how education reform has been held up. So again, they're dividing up the pie in terms of the committee chairmanships. For instance, Rosemary McAuliffe, the 1st District Democratic State Senator, gets bounced as chairman of the Education Committee. In will come Steve Litzow from the 41st District, I think an outstanding state senator and a Republican. Mm-hmm. But you're going to have some very conservative committee chairs. And how long this coalition of convenience lasts, you can't forecast the future.
Well, as soon as the economy turns south, if it truly does, or if the economy goes badly, I think it's going to be very bad for any coalition to stay together. If the economy does well, then everybody's going to be standing in line to...
You get blamed if things go bad.
Yeah.
You get blamed. And there, of course, all of these people, frustrated idealists at Olympia bars, saying that this is the worst session of the legislature since the last one.
There was something going on here in Seattle that we were talking about it before the show, that perhaps we in Seattle can't do what we would like to do with it because of federal law. But it relates to coal trains. Why would there be trains of coal coming through Seattle?
If you locate a coal export terminal at Cherry Point north of Bellingham, the trains bound for that port would essentially go through one population center, Spokane in the national press, down to the Tri-Cities, down the Columbia River, and then up through Tacoma, Seattle, Edmonds, Bellingham, and eventually to Cherry Point. 18 of them a day, some of them more than a mile in length.
Wow. And so those coal trains, the coal is coming from where?
The coal will be coming from southeast Montana, northern Wyoming. That's where it is to be mined. Mm-hmm. The coal companies are losing business to natural gas head over heels.
Yeah.
So they need to develop export markets. China is the export market, and so they are desperate to ship the stuff out here and to send it across the Pacific.
So we here in the United States, if we do have an energy policy, it does seem to be geared towards energy that is better for the environment everywhere. And yet, we seem to be saying, okay, let's export the coal to China because we don't care if they pollute.
Because they have jobs. A point is not understood. The industry argues that if they don't get it from here, and we have low sulfur coal, they'll get it from Australia and various other places. In Australia, they're arguing, and if we aren't allowed to ship it out of Australia, they'll get it from the Northwest. It is a kind of a bait and switch all over the place. The important point, if my voice will permit me to say it, is made by Tom Power, who's an economist at the University of Montana. Namely, because our coal is so inexpensive, it will allow the Chinese to continue to operate old, very polluting power plants rather than phasing them out. It will still be economical for them to do to operate the dirtiest of all plants, and of course, they are now the #1 emitter of global warming gases.
Really? So with all of that, we here in Seattle, because of federal law, we can't say that thou shalt not bring coal trains through Seattle. Is that right?
Under the Interstate Commerce Act, this is one thing that the feds control. At the same time, what we're trying to do, what Mayor McGinn is trying to do, what Representative Carlisle is trying to do, is get the environmental impact statement not simply to look at the impact this is going to have on wetlands up at Sherry Point, but rather look at the transportation impacts, the economic impacts, the potential health impacts, the impacts, say, on emergency vehicles being held up, there could be economic detriment if our waterfront is paralyzed, for instance, and to look at a broad range of impacts. The people that want to build the coal port, of course, want a very, very narrow study, site-specific.
Yeah. Are we going to get any assistance of any kind from either one of our U.S. senators on this issue?
Skillfully and backstage, they are not burning their coal, as a matter of fact, on this issue, for the very simple reason that two key elements of their coalition are going at each other, probably still going at each other as we're taping this down at the Seattle Center, and that is that the hard hat unions really want this. The King County Labor Council's endorsed it, the Boeing machinists have endorsed it, but the environmentalists and the liberal faith community oppose it passionately. They dominated the hearing in Seattle and have dominated all of the hearings across the state except Ferndale. So what happens when two parts of your constituency are fighting? You keep your head down.
And so that's what we can expect there. Well, when is the issue likely to come to a head, and when is a decision likely to be made?
They have to scope the environmental impact statement. Then they have to do their study. We'll see whether Representative Carlisle, whose role in this is very constructive, is able to persuade the state of Washington to do its own study, broad one of economic and transportation impacts, and essentially take a holistic view of what this will do and what this will mean in the Pacific Northwest, not simply, again, something site-specific. So Carlisle is trying to push the state to do its own evaluation because he feels that Seattle may not have that much clout against the federal government and the Interstate Commerce Act, nor will Edmonds, nor will Marysville. But at the same time, the state of Washington will. After all, we just gave the president a 600,000 vote majority and reelected a U.S. senator, a Democratic U.S. senator with 60% of the vote.
Is there a possibility that someone will sponsor some type of informational referendum or initiative to get it on the ballot, just for the sake of sending a message?
Public opinion is split on this, and the coal companies and the railroads are desperate enough that they've spent more than $1 million on TV spots, which you see on cable TV, talking about coal ports being good, and they'll get it. China will get it from someplace else if they don't get it from us. But at the same time, it's interesting. There is a genuine citizens movement against this, and looking at a sea of people in red T-shirts and giant paper mache salmon and polar bears and even signs where you disagreed with something since you weren't allowed to boo. You held up a sign saying "red herring" when this is a movement, and when you turn out 2,000 people for a hearing in Bellingham, sort of thing makes politicians stand up and take notice.
Speaking of standing up and taking notice, we are very fortunate that Joel Connelly, the SeattlePI.com, is with us, as he is just about every month right here on Sound Month in Review on Public Exposure. We do apologize to everyone for our coughing. It's just that seems to be that time of the month, and we were talking about various reasons, but we won't blame anybody in government for this one. We'll just take this one on our own.
I won't mention the mayor's waterfront press conference outdoors in 40-degree weather. Missed.
I want to talk about the impact of something that the state of Washington has done. And that is the impact of the same-sex marriage initiative law that is taken place here in Washington state. Is it impactful outside of this state?
There has been a sea change in public opinion. As recently as 2004, the Washington Post Wall Street Jungle poll nationally showed 34% support for same-sex marriage, 64% opposition. The poll that came out this week on the same issue showed 51% in favor, 40% opposed. Still, marriage equality was 0 for 32 in statewide elections until this year. Somebody had to break the ice, and Washington and Maryland and Maine and indirectly Minnesota did.
What does it mean? I mean, do you think that the public is really looking at kind of a let's leave people alone, let's tackle an issue such as our economy? Is that what they're doing?
You put your finger on something that's always been part of our life here, and that is, the right to do your thing, your right to privacy. It's a rather strongly felt right here. Not that much encouragement of conformism. But beyond that, I think in the gay community, they've done a marvelous job of basically person-to-person contact. That the couple down the block may be gay. Somebody you meet at church is gay. A brother or a sister or an aunt or an offspring are gay. And that you've had increasingly people getting to know gays and lesbians not as an ostracized sect confined to Fire Island and the East Village in New York City, but rather quite the contrary, neighbors and friends.
So is Washington State looked at nationally now as a leader?
I think very much so. Our initiative kicked in before the ones in Maine and Maryland did. 6 states preceded us, but with all of them, it was action by the legislature or action by the courts. This was action by the voters, quite specifically the voters of King County, 2/3 of whom ratified this.
Let's go to something that's clearly national, and that is President Obama and his relationship with the Republican House. Certainly the words fiscal cliff, which I'm not sure that I'm actually ready to adopt, but those words are all over the news. And my question for this is there a solution that both President Obama and the Republican House will accept before the end of this year?
People have defined things about basically if you go midway between $800 million billion in higher taxes and $1.6 billion in higher taxes, you get 1.2 or 1.25 billion. That there would be middle ground, and the public overwhelmingly wants people in the upper 2% to pay more, and we aren't really acting to soak the rich, only that they bathe regularly. And when their tax rates were 39% under the Clinton administration, they did real well. And in fact, that's the key to prosperity in America, is when the middle class has buying power. So you don't want to take it away. And this would be absolutely insane to kind of kick the recession back into gear right at the time when we're pulling out of it.
Well, then this comes into play something that seems to be pretty dastardly, and I think it's known as the Hastert rule. What is the Hastert rule?
I think the rule that the Republicans have imposed is that, if we're the majority in the House of Representatives, we will apply our majority. We will not construct any majority involving the Democrats in the House, even if there are 190 or 200 or now 201 of them, or there'll be 202 of them when they complete the election for the Jesse Jackson Jr.'s seat, so that what was that famous line from that awful TV commercial years ago? Mother, please, I'd rather do it myself. And there's this type of attitude that they will be, that they will form the majority. And in addition, and you've got a whole bunch of crazy people in that majority, and they come from gerrymandered districts. The Democrats got 1 million votes more than the Republicans in races for the House this year. They got 51% of the vote in House races. They got only 46% of the seats.
So the way that the Hastert rule is that there can be a majority of the Republicans in the House, but if you add the minority of the Republicans and the majority of the Democrats, and it's more members of the House want to vote on it, the way that Hastert rule is the Republicans say, well, you can't vote?
The Democrats have a discharge petition, where if they get a majority of the House, they can bring it to the floor. But the House leadership, of course, does not want this.
Yeah.
But the rule is that the majority must be made up of the majority party people. That that has to be the Republicans who vote for this, and that you cannot have a coalition of votes, particularly if the Democrats are the majority in it.
You know, the funny thing of it is that every time I voted, I don't vote for party. I vote for an individual. It's a person. He happens to be with a particular party, or she happens to be with a particular party, but that's not my choice.
Well, we used to have an awful lot more cooperation across party lines. The Republicans were only about 170 or so in the House of Representatives, but a congressman from Ohio named William McCullough was absolutely vital in securing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So there used to be cobbling together of majorities that invited people from both sides of the aisle, particularly also in the U.S. Senate. But then again, with the increasingly polarized atmosphere, our legislative bodies are becoming a lot more like parliaments, where there's the people that are in control and the opposition, and rarely do people vote across the aisle.
Speaking of across the aisle, Al Franken crossed the aisle for sure from comedy into the U.S. government. Is Stephen Colbert next?
He actually came out ahead in a poll of South Carolina voters. The governor is very huffy. Colbert will not be appointed. But with Franken didn't simply do this as a lark, but settled back in Minnesota, got reconnected with the state, and he and Franny got all over the place, and people liked them. They liked him. Yet he has tried to, as much as possible, be a workhorse, even when he's sitting in the chair and somebody says something inane on the floor.
Well, we'll follow that one for sure. Something that just came out from the National Intelligence Council about the way that the world is going to look in 2030. They made a lot of predictions, but one of the things that they said is that China will surpass the U.S. as the largest economy in the 2020s. And they added this, is that the study said that the U.S., while weaker, will probably remain the top player in 2 decades thanks to its role in resolving global crises. But the U.S. military will be, but the military will be the U.S.'s biggest expenditure. I mean, isn't that a sad state of affairs that our economy, according to the National Intelligence Council, is driven by our military spending?
Whenever somebody comes out with these things, though, it quite often doesn't come true. Remember, you had the Japanese industrial colossus that suddenly hit chuck holes in the road. You had the Europeans talking about American efficiency and so on in the 1960s, and we stumbled badly in Vietnam. So inevitably, when somebody is considered to be riding high, they do hit deep chuck holes in the road. And I think the Chinese economy, very corrupt, overextended, doing things too fast, and having horrendous railroad accidents as a result, and so on. They may not necessarily crash, but nonetheless, they're going to ship off, go off the rails.
There was another aspect of the predictions from the National Intelligence Council that I didn't find to be particularly surprising. They said this. They said Europe, Japan, and Russia are expected to remain in slow economic decline through 2030, while a number of middle-tier countries could rise, such as Colombia, Egypt, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, and Turkey. But they also said they don't know what to think about Iran. So all of those things sound reasonable to me.
Well, I think that with some of those countries, you have simply too much corruption and chaos to realize their full potential. Others, like Indonesia, for instance, where you have a great deal of resource in the way of oil, they could very well kind of move up third world to second world, verging on first world. Or you could have a situation like you have in South Africa, where part of it is first world, part of it is third world.
In any event, it's going to be something that United States leadership is going to play a huge role in what happens from here. And I'm just not certain if I am feeling particularly bullish on our leadership as a whole, since they can't get together on this fiscal cliff.
The divisions are kind of awful. I'm reminded, however, and was reminded when I flew over the Arizona Memorial on a trip to Hawaii, that when this country has been able to get together on things, there's nothing we can't do, and nothing we can't do better and faster. There's a story when Germany declared war on us, and the personnel from the German embassy in Washington, D.C. went back to Berlin. The former finance minister gave them a pep talk saying, when you come here, you'll learn what coordination and leadership can do in terms of productivity, and implying that Germany was a far more productive and more organized country. Ultimately, we proved to be, and we outproduced them, and we outorganized them, so that the capacities of this country are boundless and are endless, but when we're at each other's throats, they are very limited.
Yeah. We only have about a minute left, but I got to get to a story that you recently wrote. The headline is Pearl Harbor, the survivors grow few, the lessons live on. What are the lessons that do live on from Pearl Harbor?
First of all, inattention leads to catastrophe. From Pearl Harbor to when the U.S. was moving north in Korea and MacArthur refused to believe that the Chinese were going to attack us, to 9/11. Secondly, that wars are sometimes won by firing power. Looking at how Admiral Nimitz and General Marshall sacked commanders that weren't doing it in World War II, and how, for instance, with Tommy Franks and Richard Sanchez, we did not do that in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And finally, again, the lesson that our country united will not be defeated. My parents, as an example, being Wendell Willkie supporters against Franklin Roosevelt, united around Roosevelt. My mother quit her journalism job, drove a meat truck in San Francisco during the war, and my father, until almost the day he died, could get her to blush talking about the big bulging muscles that his wife had during those years.
Well, with that, that'll be the last word. Joel, thank you very much for being with us. And that's all for Public Exposure this month on Sound Month in Review. We'll see you next time right here. Take care.